I'm going to be talking about Avebury, this wonderful site just up the road. I assume you all know it. And for those of you perhaps who are here for the first time, you must make sure that you have a look at Avebury and its associated ancient sites. Now, as Anthony said, I knew from the first time that I went to Avebury that I was going to write about the place. But it took another 30 years to develop my understanding to a point where I felt I had something to say. And fundamental to that was the archaeology. The archaeologists have done a lot more work on the site, and we've finally got the dating, the chronology. They only came up with radiocarbon dates for Silbury Hill in the last year or two, which was a fantastic step forward. And the advent of astronomy programs that I could run on my computer and save me the trouble of doing all the mathematics. So this research is very much grounded in the data, the archaeology and anthropology of Avebury, and the astronomy. But don't worry, I'm not going to lose you in the mathematics, okay? That's a promise. The gentleman at the back. So, Avebury, our ancestors and the stars. And as you're all probably well aware, work on the prehistoric sites in Britain has shown how interested in the heavens were our ancestors. You know, it's long known the interest in the solar cycles at Stonehenge. They've been writing about it for years, and the work of people like Alexander Thom has shown how deeply our ancestors were involved with the lunar cycles too, how closely they followed not only the sun but also the moon. The sun and moon were their daily fare. Everything they did was coordinated according to what was going on in the sky. You know, and not just the calendar. The sun and the moon, of course, formed the rhythm of the day and the night and the seasons, the moon, the weeks, the months, but also their relationship with the gods, with the divine powers. However they perceived these powers, it was the heavens that was an indicator of this divine presence, as well as the earth, but the heavens too. You have to remember the sky brings storms. The sky brings lightning. The sky can bring all kinds of well-being and trouble. So our ancestors' lives were governed to a large measure by what came from the sky. And so close, by necessity, was their interest in the heavens, and so deep and so long-standing was their observance that I became convinced that they were also profoundly following the stars, that their star knowledge was as great as their stellar and their their solar and their lunar knowledge. And, well, the story really began in my hometown, Glastonbury, where I became very interested in an ancient mound that's on the fourth hill of Glastonbury. On the summit of Windmill Hill, there's a mound. Nobody knows anything about it. But what is interesting is if you stand on this mound and look at Glastonbury Tor on the horizon, it's well placed for the rising of sun and moon and stars. So I've put up here for example, how in the late 5th millennium BC, the three stars that form the belt of Orion were rising up the steep northernmost flank of the Tor. I thought that was rather neat. And as you know, the belt of Orion points to the brightest star in the sky, Sirius. And Sirius rises after Orion, in the same location on the horizon. And, it'll take me a minute to get the hang of. And I noticed that from the mound on Windmill Hill, that over a period of a few thousand years, over the Tor, that Sirius moved, due to precession, from rising on the back of the Tor around, 4,200, 4,800 BC. So by the end of the 4th millennium, it's rising up the steep northern flank of the Tor. So the angle of star rise is marked by the angle of the steep northern flank of Glastonbury Tor. Now, the interesting thing about this particular alignment is that it coincides with the rising of the midwinter sun. So in this diagram, courtesy of Robin, we have a demonstration of how from the mound on Windmill Hill, the sun can be observed rising up the northern flank of Glastonbury Tor at midwinter. So this is the lowest point that the sun reaches in its path across the eastern horizon. Now, this is for about the year 0, but in prehistory, say 2000 BC, 2,000 years earlier, the sun wasn't so much rising up the side of Glastonbury Tor, but was rising slightly below it. And to see the sunrise at winter solstice, it would have been necessary to cut a few little notches in the side of the Tor. And then you would have seen the top rim of the sun flashing in the notches. And this would have enabled some quite precise astronomy, some quite precise calendar keeping to be done at this date. And we know, again, from the work of people like Alexander Thom, that this kind of event interested our prehistoric ancestors a great deal. And around about 3200 BC, the rising of the winter solstice sun coincided with the rising path of Sirius, which in some traditions is known as the sun behind the sun, the esoteric sun, the inner sun. Now, just dwelling on this alignment for a little bit longer, again, we're standing on the mound on Windmill Hill, looking at the Tor. And the interesting thing about the winter solstice sunrise up the Tor's flank is that at this moment in the 26,000 year, thereabouts, cycle of precession, the winter solstice sun is over the galactic center. In other words, due to precession, the date when the sun is over the galactic center changes over the course of the 26,000 year cycle. And it's only in this era that the rising of the winter solstice sun, the position of the winter solstice sun, coincides with the galactic core. This now it's a matter of debate how long this alignment takes place. It doesn't happen on one day. It won't be December the 21st, 2012. It's a whole era, because the diameter of the sun is pretty big, the galactic core itself is pretty big, and the two are coinciding for a course of several decades, or perhaps if you see it in terms of the sun crossing the dark rift that marks the center of the galaxy, this era lasts for about 100 years. Now, in the 26,000-year cycle of precession, you can see we can fudge it a bit. You know, this is the era. We are now in the middle of the era when the winter solstice sun is over the center of the galaxy. Now, conversely, the summer solstice sun is pointing in the other direction. So if you were to be on the Mound or anywhere at the summer solstice this year, and you were looking at the rising sun, maybe you were at Stonehenge. Any of you at Stonehenge? Summer solstice? You would have been looking into Gemini at the so-called galactic anticenter. In other words, you would have been looking away. You would have been on an alignment of the galactic core, the Earth, and then outward into deep space, away from the center of our galaxy. In 2010, we had quite an extraordinary alignment take place, where there was an eclipse of the moon on the winter solstice, which meant that in 2010, there was an alignment of galactic core, sun, Earth, moon, and galactic anticenter. Now, that kind of thing, where you have alignment of the nodes of the moon, the sun, and stars, I think is just the kind of thing that would have vastly entertained our ancestors. And they would have been groping for the meaning of that kind of event. So, finally, we come back to Avebury, and we're standing on another windmill hill here at Avebury. And I begin here because this is really the first well-documented site in the area. This low hill, Windmill Hill, has on its summit what is called a causewayed enclosure. Built in the 4th millennium BC, 3 concentric rings of earthworks, and the archaeologists have found all sorts of evidence in the bottom of the ditches there, including evidence for autumn and winter occupation, which involves ceremonial feasting, ritual sacrifice of various types of animal, including cattle. Now, from the summit of Windmill Hill, looking southeast, you can make out Martinsell Hill on the ridge of the Wessex Chalk Escarpment. There it is, Martinsell Hill. From Windmill Hill, that is the position of the winter solstice sunrise. So I feel we've got a pretty good winter solstice, midwinter alignment going on here. Not only have we got midwinter sun rising on this alignment, but we've also got midsummer moon. This could have been important too. Down below it, here, lies the future site of Avebury. Avebury is not yet in existence, but you can see it's on the alignment from Windmill Hill to the winter solstice rising sun. Now, over here, you can see just below the horizon, West Kennet Longbarrow, constructed in the mid-4th millennium BC, and then A couple of thousand years later, you can see Silbury Hill. Pretty much on the same alignment as the western end of West Kennet. And out of sight, below the other side of the Wessex Chalk Escarpment, is Knapp Hill, another ancient causewayed enclosure. These sites, Windmill Hill and Knapp Hill, these show evidence of occupation from the Mesolithic period. So we're going back thousands upon thousands of years. This area was a key area to be settled by our ancestors, mainly because the soil here is very light. It was a summit of hills. There was a lot of grassland, a lot of game. It was a very good place to be at that time. Now, what, if anything, is taking place astronomically on this alignment? And what emerges is, here we are, from Windmill Hill, on this alignment, Knapp Hill, West Kennet Longbarrow, and eventually Silbury Hill, we find a cluster of stars rising on this alignment. Here is due south, and as you know, any star low on the southern horizon will rise in this area, reach a zenith due south, and then set in this area over here. And at that time, at the time of Windmill Hill, mid-4th millennium BC, the Southern Cross was visible, rising over West Kennet. So here I've shown the Southern Cross at about 1 a.m. Comes up here. By 3 a.m., Alpha Centauri is rising over West Kennet. So Southern Cross, that's the pointer to the hidden southern pole. And here we have Alpha Centauri and Beta Centauri pointing themselves to the Southern Cross. Alpha Centauri is the third brightest star in the sky. When Sirius rises over here on the winter solstice alignment, in midwinter, early in the night, it's long set in the west by the time Alpha Centauri rises. The second brightest star in the sky, Canopus, is always invisible in the northern hemisphere. So in other words, Alpha Centauri is the second brightest star in the sky. I think our ancestors would have been very interested in this star and in these constellations. Now, what is absolutely fascinating about these star groups, the constellation of Crux, or the Southern Cross, and Alpha and Beta Centauri, is that they are embedded in the Milky Way. And as they rose here, the Milky Way, at an angle like this, was setting down towards the west. Just before 3 a.m., about 2:30 a.m., as the Southern Cross reached its zenith due south, and Alpha Centauri appeared, in this era, the Milky Way leveled around the entire horizon. This event only happens once in the 26,000-year cycle of precession at this latitude. Are you with me? So in this era, lasting for about 1,000 years, from about 4,000 BC to about 3,000 BC, exactly the period when our ancestors were living and building Windmill Hill and West Kennet Longbarrow, these stars deep in the southern sky were indicators of a phenomenal galactic event when the entire Milky Way became visible around the entire horizon. An astonishing event. We will never see it. It won't happen again for about another 17,500 years. Here's West Kennet. It's interesting that it was ceremonially closed around 2500 BC, and this was the time when these stars of the Southern Cross and Alpha and Beta Centauri were no longer rising over the Long Barrow. And we can now turn our attention to Avebury. Here's an aerial view of Avebury Circle today. And thanks to Photoshop, here is a view of how it kind of looked. This is a rather idealized presentation around the middle of the third millennium. We've got the huge outer ditch and bank dug into the white chalk, would have been a brilliant white. We've got the great inner circle. We've got two inner circles. Sorry, the great outer circle, I should say. The two inner circles, the southern inner circle, the northern inner circle, at the center of which is the Cove. Center here, the tallest stone on site, no longer in existence, the obelisk, the so-called D feature, and over here we have a cluster of stones that form the southern entrance, and the stump of what remains of the ring stone. You can see avenues leading off from at least two of the four entrances to the henge. Now, this is what the henge sort of ended up looking like, maybe by 2400, 2300 BC. But what did it look like originally, before the inner circles were built? And this is pretty close approximation to what was here initially. It's most likely that these stones that form the Cove and the obelisk and now the southern entrance were the first megaliths on the site. Not long after that, the henge was built. The inner circles come much later. I think the inner circles were more to do with the sun and the moon, the solar and the lunar cycles. But you can see that there is a main axis. Indeed, this axis goes through as many as 12 of the 18 stones that are considered primary to the site. So we can consider this to be a pretty good alignment. And it's approximately 340 degrees to 160 degrees. So what is going on this alignment? What are we looking at? Or more to the point, what were the ancient people looking at? Have we got views to the horizon along this alignment? What were they doing? So here we are. We're standing in the middle of the southern inner circle, and we're looking south. And here is the southern entrance. And with all the stones in place, and a couple of posts put in a known post hole socket there. This one I have merely hypothesized because it's under the road and we don't know what's there. But I think there's enough evidence to show that we have quite a wonderful frame, view to the southern horizon formed by Wadden Hill. I think it's clear that the arrangement of the henge, the early stones and then the subsequent stones was all about framing this view of the southern horizon, and especially Wadden Hill. Now, if we look at our main axis, the 160-degree axis, you see it's at the beginning, the bottom of Wadden Hill. So anything rising deep in the south will appear here and then ascend, reach a zenith here before setting over here. I think this demonstrates that the people who built Windmill Hill and were looking at the stars of the Southern Cross and Alpha and Beta Centauri were also interested in those stars at the site of Avebury, and that the great outer circle, when it was originally built with the white chalk thrown up onto the bank, was meant to be a model of the Milky Way. So here we are. Here's a view at night. Midwinter. Sirius has long set with Orion in the west. We're looking through the southern entrance to Wadden Hill, and here's the Milky Way, rising up at this angle over the horizon. A couple of hours later, the Milky Way is dropping towards the west, and the top three stars of the Southern Cross appear over the main alignment at the foot of Wadden Hill. By about 2:30 a.m., the top three stars of the Southern Cross appear directly over the southern entrance above Wadden Hill. Beta Centauri is appearing on the main alignment. Now, look at the date. It's 2500 BC. Most of these stones would be in place. But if we'd been here 500 years earlier, we would have seen the whole of the Southern Cross. We would have seen the star that formed the base of the Southern Cross, and we also would have seen Alpha Centauri. But over the course of the last 500 years, these stars are dropping to the south. They're being lost due to precession, and the stars are no longer visible above the horizon, or they're being lost due to the extinction angle. And you can see I've drawn a kind of a black line around the horizon where any lower magnitude stars will be lost. So here we have it. Avebury Henge, encircled by the Milky Way, 360 degrees around the horizon, is constructed as a mirror of the cosmos. The henge itself represents the Milky Way. Its main alignments are looking at key stars to the south as well as to the north. They're looking at the rising and the setting of Cygnus to the north, but I don't have time to go into that here. Cygnus is the northern cross, the mirror to the southern cross in the south. And the whole henge and the monument, it's as though they wanted to bring in every cycle of the sun and the moon and the stars into the body of the monument. And I think in this picture, I'm even suggesting that here we have an imaginary line drawn through the center of the Milky Way, and it's crossed in the east by the ecliptic, the path of the sun, the moon, and the planets, and in the west. So if you have this crossing point of the ecliptic and the galaxy in the west, the Southern Cross in the south, this crossing point of the ecliptic and the Milky Way in the east, and the Northern Cross in the north, you have a fourfold division of the Milky Way, which is represented on the ground in Avebury by the 4 entrances. Now, just to give you a little bit, try to persuade you a little bit more that these were the astronomical events that our ancestors were really looking at, I just want to bring your attention briefly to the so-called D feature, or D facade, that is considered to be among the earliest stones on the site. And if you look along the top of it, it forms a very nice alignment to the horizon and to anything rising over Wadden Hill. And you can see the large stones that form the southern entrance beyond it. The ring stone is behind this stone, and if the ring stone had a partner, which some think it did, it would have been behind this stone. If we were to put a box here, it's quite a precise line of sight, and just bring up a few lines for the rising of stars, we find in that box we have got the rising of Beta Centauri, Beta Crucis, and Delta Crucis rising throughout this period, but exactly here, round about 2720. So at this point, I can move to a decade for precision. And at this point, it's the astronomy that allows us to date the archaeology. And indeed, the archaeologists think that that would be right in the middle of the most likely dates for the construction of the D feature. Now, I don't know who's proving what here, but I'd like to think that this is more evidence to show that the people who built Avebury, the monument builders, were very interested in these stars that accompanied the rising of the Milky Way. So here it is. Very difficult to get this all in one picture, so I've broken it up into 3. This is standing on the northern bank, looking along the main axis. There's a stone in the Cove. There's the back stone of the Cove. There's the obelisk behind it. So this is the main alignment. We're looking at the rising point of these crucial stars. Here it is in close-up. I mean, it's just a jumble of stones, isn't it? But if you look down this alignment, you can see a clear view to this horizon. And here we are looking towards the western entrance and the Beckhampton Avenue. Here's the big stone, the Swindon stone, by the northern entrance. Now, I don't know if it ever looked like this. I imagine that the site was probably always a work in progress. But this is pretty good. It's an ideal representation. And here we have the West Kennet Avenue. And again, just to have a bit of fun with Photoshop, here it is reconstructed. I do enjoy doing that. You can even improve the weather. And I like to think that the monument builders would have perhaps have seen these avenues as arms of the galaxy, or even the path of the ecliptic, the path of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, here we are at the terminus, the end of the Kennet Avenue, at the ugly concrete posts that mark the sanctuary. And again, with the aid of Photoshop, I've done a reconstruction. We have two circles of stone with a timber structure inside that was most likely surmounted with bucrania, ox horns. We don't know, but it does seem likely. Now, here we are at the end of the Second Avenue, the Western Avenue, or the Beckhampton Avenue, and we're looking at the Adam and Eve stones. So again, the avenue sweeps in from Avebury, comes up to Adam, and thanks to the archaeologists who have excavated this site, we now know the sequence of monuments were on this site that culminated in a cove. Adam was just one stone that formed part of a cove. We've got enough detail to make a guess at the astronomy of this cove. And at first glance, it looks like a winter solstice alignment. The winter solstice sun tracks down here, but goes over the central alignment to rise here. Again, we could have a mid-summer moon alignment, but you can see the extremes reached by the moon. Yes, they could be observed at this site, but slap down the middle of the alignment of the Longstones Cove, we come back to the rising of Sirius. It seemed that at the end of this avenue, they were particularly interested in the first magnitude star, the greatest star in the sky, the rising of Sirius, and I hypothesized that it was linked with the harvests. What makes this especially interesting is that if you track this alignment over the horizon, so here we are, Longstones Cove, at the end of the Beckhampton Avenue, over the summit of Folly Hill, goes down to the summit of Silbury Hill. So Silbury Hill is invisible from the Longstones Cove, but it's a pretty darn good alignment. And there does seem to be evidence for the observation for the heliacal setting of Sirius over the summit of Folly Hill. So here we've got the heliacal rising. From Avebury, we've got the heliacal setting. So this prolonged interest in Sirius seems to have been maintained over thousands of years. Now, coming back to Avebury, and this is my partner, Philippa, who I did most of this research with, and unfortunately she can't be here today, so she's here in spirit. And we just fell in love with these stones. They're just so exquisite. And what I would do is I would photograph them from different angles and then take them home and do a mirror line down them. It's such a fun way of looking at the stone, and it brings out features that aren't immediately obvious. Now, I had a dozen of these to show you, but Pippa said, leave them out. You don't have enough time. So I'm sorry, that's the only one you're going to get to enjoy. But returning now to the site of the obelisk, the biggest stone on the site, in the middle of the southern inner circle, and looking south, to the southern entrance, to where these crucial southern stars were rising over Waden Hill, I now want to bring to your attention to where they were setting. Okay? And in this era, the middle of the third millennium, we find these stars have reached a zenith, 180 due south about here, and are setting in this part of the horizon over here. Now, I call this stone the Silbury stone because, as I am sure many of you are aware that if you stand by the concrete marker that marks the position of the obelisk and look and take a step or two steps to one side, Silbury Hill appears from behind this stone. And you can just make out the summit of it at the base of Wadden Hill on the horizon. So we've got a good alignment from here to this notch, the Wessex Chalk Escarpment and Wadden Hill. And lo and behold, we find that the final three stars of the Southern Cross are setting on this alignment late in the third millennium, forming a triangle or a pyramid that is mimicked by the shape of Silbury Hill. And indeed, if you were to imagine Silbury Hill extended to a cone, it would fit exactly. So here's a view of Silbury that we now know was begun at some point after 2500 BC, probably about 2450. We don't really know what they did in the first few decades. They were up to something. And then gradually over the subsequent years, maybe a few decades, maybe 150 years, maybe 250 years at the most, they completed the monument, this huge mound, the greatest earthen mound in Europe. We don't know how much more was ever on the top. It does seem likely that it did form more of a pyramid, more of a cone, and that in the Saxon or the Roman and then subsequently the Saxon era, the top was flattened and a settlement that could be defended was built on top. Well, we never know because the top has been sheared off. Possibly, some people have hypothesized the big post was on top of the hill to complete the pyramid. Here in this photo, recently taken by Lucy Pringle, we have a pyramid, crop circle appearing, pointing to Silbury Hill, on Wadden Hill. Wadden Hill, Woden Hill, a Romano-British god. There was a Roman settlement here. They think that there was possibly a temple to this deity up in this area at some point, maybe in the Roman period, maybe subsequently in the Saxon period. I know the Saxons got up to all sorts of stuff at Avebury and continued with the reverence of the site. But to my mind, the fact that we have these remarkable alignments from Avebury to the southern horizon, to the rising and then the setting of these stars that are no longer visible, I think is beyond doubt. I think that the setting of the top three stars of the Southern Cross into the area of the horizon marked by Silbury Hill is far beyond simply being a coincidence. I think our ancestors built Silbury Hill to mark the setting point of the Southern Cross, or at least the three stars that remained of the Southern Cross in the 3rd millennium BC. And you see, this is the point, because when they were on Windmill Hill, or when the Mesolithic people were in the area, they would have seen the whole of the Southern Cross. They could not have missed it. Something so beautiful, so low in the southern sky, that brought with it the entire Milky Way, could not have been missed by them. It must have entered their mythology. It must have entered their star lore. And over the course of the third millennium, these stars were being lost from sight. The Milky Way, instead of forming a complete circle around the entire horizon, was being lost to the south. Instead of this great wheel of the cosmos appearing around Avebury Henge, the sky by 2000 BC must have seemed to have gone completely out of kilter. These sites were built to last, and we know they were used for observation for centuries, if not thousands of years. In other words, they could not have missed this loss of the stars in the southern sky due to precession. It would have been obvious. In fact, I don't even know, I'm still trying to argue why it would have been obvious. This is exactly the kind of thing they were looking at. They were looking at precession. Now, we know what precession is. We can measure it, we can calculate it. But they didn't have our equipment, they didn't have our cosmology. They had a completely different cosmology to us. So what would they have made of this loss? How would they have viewed this loss of ancestral stars? Stars that would have formed a major event in their midwinter skies. Well, if you think about it, the Southern Cross points to the hidden southern pole below the horizon. The Northern Cross, Cygnus, points to the visible northern pole above the horizon. You can see the circumpolar stars. You can watch the stars go around the northern pole. You can't see the stars that go around the southern pole. But you could in the 4th millennium BC. You could see the Southern Cross. You could see Alpha Centauri. And gradually these stars were going below the horizon. Now, I believe that in the ancient world, they lived according to what was essentially a tripartite cosmology, a threefold cosmology, a lower world, a middle world, and an upper world. And these three were connected by an axis, the axis mundi, or the pole between the worlds. And this pole ran from the northern pole in the sky to the hidden southern pole, and was indicated by the stars that rotated around them. And their myths, their stories, would have been told by the stars that pointed to them and revolved around them. So the Southern Cross, pointing to the hidden southern pole, would have pointed to the underworld, the lower world, the world of the ancestors, the world inhabited by the great mythic beings who lived in the land of darkness, were hidden in the darkness of the womb, that went below the dark horizon in midwinter, and there dwelt in the primal cave, the cave that ultimately in the spring gave rebirth and brought with it the new year. And this is the kind of symbolism expressed by West Kennet Longbarrow, just to the north of us here. While the northern stars spoke about the realm of the above, the beings who dwelt in the upper worlds, the beings of light, the gods, the goddesses, the immortal ones. This is the kind of cosmology that comes down in the Saxon literature, the Celtic literature, and in the ancient shamanic literature of the Northern Hemisphere. I don't think I'm making this up, that we could see Silbury Hill as the home of the ancestors. So when they built this hill, they were making a home for the ancestors. The ancestral stars that had been visible for thousands of years going down below the horizon, they were making a home. So they were saying, okay, you're being lost from sight, but we'll make somewhere for you to live until the time when you will come back again. Now, whether they could calculate, whether they had the knowledge, which I doubt, because I don't think they thought like we did, that these stars would come back again after another cycle of precession, we'll never know. But I think they kind of knew in their guts that they might. So this is a home for the ancestral star beings, a place which the stars went into, and in 17,500 years, they might come back out of again. And I have spoken for almost an hour, so I better call it a day. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. That was absolutely fantastic. I've heard this talk in different forms over several years, 3 or 4 times, and I'm really getting the hang of it at last. We've just time for one quick question before we move on. Anybody like to ask a question? Yes.
Just to ask, Sirius is still, visible in the sky now. Out of all these stars that you mentioned, does the Sirius rising and setting relate to any of these alignments now?
No.
Okay.
It's moved. Sirius is an odd star, something I'm sure the Dogon would agree with. It kind of has its own vagaries, but I think in some ways it is a key star to understanding the mysteries of this site, and I think you're right to draw attention back again to it today, because it does hold secrets. It is on important alignments, and what those are, I think will be revealed in due course. I think it's a key marker.
Yeah, that was my feeling.
Thank you.